Welcome to audio highlights for Chapter 13, Native Americans. This chapter is unique because we're going to study a group of people that don't necessarily have an immigration history, but definitely have a history of both beautiful cultural beliefs and practices and art and stories, and also one that's characterized by struggle and hardship and a history of trauma that has even leaked into today's generations. So let's get started. First, looking at the term Native Americans, it's important to know that that's a general term. So it encompasses a large number of people, but there are different ways to define this. And so legally, if one is a registered member of a tribe, then typically there's a blood quantum level that is thought to be 25% or 1/4 or more Native American ancestry. So our chapter does some work in defining what that means, why someone would need or want that type of analysis of their blood, and also what kinds of feelings it evokes in Native Americans to have to prove their status as members to this group. So that's unique. You haven't heard us talk about that in any other cultural groups in terms of a blood test to determine one's membership to the group. This also, like every other group we've talked about, is a very heterogeneous group, meaning that it's made up of people with very different backgrounds that may fall into this same group known as Native Americans. So just to give you a small idea of how different these groups, individuals in these groups could be, is that there are over 565 tribes that are recognized federally. That doesn't even encompass those that identify themselves as tribes and nations, but that aren't federally recognized. So over 565 of those, and there are over 150 languages. So this is definitely not a group of people that if we know one person, we can assume that we know a great deal about the entire cultural group, but it is definitely a group that, as many others, that we can learn very much from real stories of real people, and that it's so important to start there with our learning rather than to just blindly accept a lot of the teachings that our media portray, which often include these very old stereotypes that have been passed on from generation to generation. And speaking of kind of historical trauma to this group and the trouble that the media sometimes continues to perpetuate in the way that we portray Native Americans, is that it's very important to know the history of this group to understand today's challenges and strengths of Native Americans. So our book does a great job of walking us through what is divided by what they call 5 stages that lead to the current state of tribal sovereignty. So we start with the removal period that was between the 1600s to 1840s, and then to today's most recent stage, which is called the self-determination period. So I hope that you'll read through and understand the big changes within and between those stages and how they're meaningful. It helps me to ask myself when I'm studying the historical side of a group of people, how does this play into today's experiences by Native Americans? And one way that it does, in a term that you'll hear come up throughout this chapter and that you'll need to consider in working with Native Americans, is what's known as historical trauma and historical trauma response. And what that means is different effects, sometimes societal or political or both, that have had transgenerational effects. One of these that our textbook goes into the greater detail about are the effects of residential schools. And these were actually boarding schools where Native American children were removed from their families and sent off to live at these boarding schools, with the ultimate purpose being to remove the Native American culture from these children's lives. And so it was a systematic devaluing of their Native American identity. They lost knowledge of their language, of their practices, of their traditions. There was repeated incidents of abuse that were unreported and therefore unresolved. So this disruption to families sometimes was never repaired or never fixed. Families sometimes were broken and never reunited. So the effects of this have been passed on from generation to generation, and you see that in many different ways. So sometimes you see that in poor health outcomes, like high incidence of alcoholism, tuberculosis, diabetes. You might see it in high dropout rates, or in low income levels, or high rates of unemployment and poverty. We also know that there have been systematic incidences of discrimination and just general hate towards Native American culture. We know that one of the largest residential boarding schools for Native American children was founded by a man whose motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man." And so what he believed was that to properly educate these children, we needed to remove all aspects of their Native American culture. And in retrospect, we see how damaging and hurtful this has been to this entire culture. But at the time, this was a belief and a set of practices that was embraced by the majority of society. This chapter looks into a number of different cultural beliefs that sometimes run at odds with our American mainstream practices, and so sometimes it's ignorance of Native American culture that leads to these differences and these disputes, and other times it's not that people don't know, but it's just a choice to be oppressive or to disregard or invalidate the Native American practices and beliefs. So one example of that might be sacred sites. Your book talks about the many places that are sacred to Native Americans and the many different ways that these play into their lives. And what is an example of maybe an instance where there could be a huge conflict between beliefs that maybe could be the result of not knowing about one's Native American's belief is that if a group of people spray like insecticide, or they practice things like logging or fencing or even building roads, then some Native Americans believe that can permanently affect in a negative way sacred sites. So you can see how this could come at odds between communities, especially on borders of reservations and those types of things. So it's important to be knowledgeable about that so that we can remember to be aware, increase our knowledge, and then apply our skills as a culturally competent professional. Also in this session, we're going to talk about the dispute and the debate between Native American over the topic of Native American mascots. So you'll have a chance to read about that issue from several different perspectives, and then to also discuss it amongst yourselves respectfully in our discussion board. As you walk through and learn more about the Native American culture, I think it's also a great opportunity to think about ways in which that you could work with or befriend or just be welcoming to a Native American individual. So we learn about things like the belief that everything is alive, so that spiritual practices are just integrated in everyday aspects of daily life, and that they are believed by many Native Americans to be necessary for wellness. So you can see how medicine may be viewed as very differently. It may not be in the shape of a pill for a Native American. It might be something more natural like a tea or an herb, and it's believed to give this inner power. Family is also a widely defined term by Native American culture, so it's much more than blood relatives. There's a greater instance of cooperation and sharing. You'll see that even ownership of different possessions is defined differently among Native Americans. So whatever belongs to an individual also belongs to the group, and vice versa. So there's not as much emphasis on one's individuality in terms of who owns what. And you can see how that may also be very different from mainstream culture, and so what types of conflicts could arise if you come from a place where you believe that that an object or a possession is truly shared by all in the group. There's also an emphasis on patience and the importance to really think through careful observation and listen and ask questions. And sometimes this can be misunderstood as someone who's not participating. For example, a student in class who doesn't speak out very often, doesn't answer questions. It could be misunderstood as somebody who wasn't engaged or interested, when really it could be a cultural way of life in terms of very much emphasis on observing and thinking and listening before speaking. And again, that factors into time. So one need only observe and listen quietly to know when it is time. So there's much less rushed and much more emphasis on being one with nature and thinking and observing and kind of being internal with one's thoughts. Another difference that I wanted to point out is direct confrontation is avoided, and that actually avoidance of direct eye contact is a sign of respect. So again, you can think about how that could be misinterpreted in terms of, in other cultures, eye contact is seen as a way of respect. So this could be a misunderstanding if we're not culturally competent and aware and knowledgeable of this way of life and way of communication. So in terms of counseling guidelines, which we know that our chapters often end with these, we know that it can be helpful to draw on traditions, which would of course mandate that you're aware of these traditions, which the best way to do that isn't necessarily through just kind of your own research. That can be helpful to get started, but if you have the rich opportunity to work with a Native American, to have these dialogues and allow them to teach you about, for example, the meaning of spirituality in their lives, the rule of opposites, and so that you can begin to use that culturally relevant communication style. Last, in terms of social justice and advocacy, it's extremely important for this group because they continue to have so many disparities in a number of different areas: health, education, employment. So there are three main areas that you can focus on for your social justice and advocacy. You could do it on an individual platform, so with a client or a student that you're working with. You could do it at a school or community level in terms of encouraging Native Americans to use their strengths to lobby for improvements. Or you could do it at a larger public arena advocacy on that sort of platform, where you could work on larger social issues that may impact Native Americans. Lastly, I wanted to encourage you. I hope that you always take advantage of our learning links in our chapters, but this one particularly has a great one that I hope that you'll take advantage of, called a Culture Quest. It's our last learning link listed in the session, and it allows you to explore through some interactive activities a number of different Native American art forms, both contemporary forms and also ones from the past. So I hope that you'll take advantage of that, and I welcome you to review this session with these notes and also with a thorough reading of your chapter.